The real story you're about to hear may very well change the way you see the world. It's an account I'm not eager to share, as I too have questioned my own sanity while exploring this rabbit hole. This is, without a doubt, the darkest and most disturbing video I ever posted on this channel. It's a story about infamous serial killers, predators, political and societal corruption, and a shadowy underworld where they all converge. A criminal web that has spread throughout our society and still lingers today. In the early hours of August 8, 1973, 17-year-old Elmer Wayne Henley called the Houston, Texas police to report that he had just shot and killed an older man inside his home. When officers arrived, they found Henley outside the property with two other teenagers, 20-year-old Timothy Curley and 15-year-old Rhonda Williams. Inside the house lay the body of a 33-year-old electrician named Dean Corll. The events that led to Corll's death were shocking to say the least. According to Elmer Wayne Henley and the two other teenagers, the group had gone to Corll's house the night before for a paint-sniffing party. At some point, when they all passed out, Dean Corll tied all of them up and started assaulting Timothy Curley. Henley, who had been a longtime friend of Corll, convinced him to untie him so he could do the same to Rhonda Williams. Corll agreed, but once Henley was free, he grabbed a gun, shot Corll dead, and then called the police. What the authorities found inside the house was even more disturbing than a dead man surrounded by terrified teenagers. A collection of extremely unsettling devices and even more unsettling audiovisual material depicting, people under the age of 18. During questioning, Elmer Wayne Henley said that he knew of several missing boys in the area who were killed by Dean Corll and buried underneath a rented storage shed. You see, in the 1970s, Houston had seen an alarming number of teenage boys disappear. Police had largely dismissed them as runaways, which meant little to no investigation was carried out. But Henley claimed that Corll, with his help and that of another teenager, David Owen Brooks, had murdered many of them. Excavations at the shed uncovered the bodies of 17 boys, aged between 13 and 19, who had been brutally attacked and murdered. Over time, more burial sites were discovered. Henley's phone call had inadvertently exposed one of the most prolific serial killers up until that point, with around 29 confirmed victims. Henley and Brooks, however, were not just passive witnesses. They had lured victims to Corll in exchange for money and often participated in the killings and the assaults. However, for most true crime enthusiasts, this is where the story of Dean Corll and the Houston mass murders ends. A tale of gruesome killings paired with a couple of biographies of the killer and his accomplices. But those of you who decide to pull the big red thread of the Dean Corll case will soon realize that the story opens one of the darkest rabbit holes you'll ever come across. When Henley and Brooks were arrested, they were held and interrogated at different police stations, and yet their statements overlapped. Henley told investigators, "Dean Corll told me that he belonged to an organization out of Dallas that bought and sold boys, ran whores and dope and stuff like that. Dean said he would pay me at least $200 for every boy I brought him, and maybe more if they were real good looking. I've come within an inch of killing him before, but I never got the nerve until yesterday. Dean always said his organization would get me if I ever did anything to him." Basically, Henley claimed that Dean Corll wasn't some lone wolf serial killer, but that he was part of a vast underground network. A few weeks later, on August 24, 1973, Houston detectives received a letter from a Californian named Steve Dale Ahern. Ahern claimed that he was once a male prostitute and an actor in pornographic films. He said that in 1971 he answered a magazine ad and was invited and paid to come to Houston for a shooting of a certain movie. The photographer, he alleged, was a man named Roy Ames. According to Ahern, Ames ran a vast pornographic empire exploiting young boys, at one point controlling nearly a third of the underground market. In his letter, Ahern claimed that Ames knew Dean Corll and used him to provide victims for his films. He even claimed to have met Corll through Ames and was invited to an orgy at Corll's Houston apartment in 1971. The investigation revealed that Ames published several magazines distributing illegal materials across California. Trying to catch him, the authorities arrested one tentacle of his operation, Guy Strait, William Byers, and a few others who ran one of the largest child pornography operations in California. Byers, an heir to a large oil fortune, allegedly had family ties to J. Edgar Hoover and was rumored to have supplied him with underage boys during his private visits. Conveniently, Byers later skipped bail and fled to Europe. A few years after their arrests, Roy Ames was also taken into custody. He did confirm that he occasionally worked with Straits and Byers, but that their operation was small-time compared to his own, which he claimed distributed materials worldwide. Besides that, not only did Dean Corll apparently know Roy Ames, but several of Corll's victims were allegedly identified in magazines distributed by Ames across the United States. In fact, two of Corll's victims, brothers Jerry and Donald Waldrop, were reported missing in 1971. According to a Houston Police Department report from that time, their father stated that his sons had been spending time with Roy Ames. In February of 1975, Houston police raided a warehouse owned by Ames. Inside, they seized enormous amounts of illicit material, some of which featured 11 of Corll's victims. Furthermore, Dean Corll's accomplice, David Owen Brooks, admitted that some of Corll's earliest victims were actually intended to be sent to California. Despite all of the evidence against him and the lengthy prison sentence he faced, Roy Ames mocked investigators, boasting that his operation would run just as effectively if he was behind bars. All of this suggests that while Ames and Corll were important, they weren't the largest players in this criminal network. Just days after Dean Corll's death, Dallas police received a troubling memo from the FBI. A 21-year-old man named Charles Brizendine had come forward, terrified for his life after uncovering something disturbing. Months earlier, before Corll's death, Brizendine had been invited to Dallas as a fellow by a sponsor of an organization called Odyssey Foundation. The sponsor's name was John David Norman. According to Brizendine, Norman initially presented the Odyssey Foundation as a self-help and travel program for young men, where fellows would visit older sponsors who would support and mentor them. However, soon, Brizendine realized the truth. Norman was running a trafficking ring, luring boys under false pretenses of offering guidance and opportunity. Now, while Brizendine was at Norman's house, he discovered literature pertaining to the Odyssey Foundation. More specifically, he found documents with pictures of the fellows, boys that were being sent to these sponsors, and he noticed some of them who were missing in real life had the word "kill" stamped on their file. Furthermore, the Houston mass murders, the Dean Corll murders, were active at the time, and Brizendine overheard Norman feeling very agitated about the discovery of Corll with someone on the phone. Feeling scared, he contacted the FBI, which prompted a raid on Norman's apartment in 1973. In addition to disturbing photographs and films, Norman possessed tens of thousands of index cards cataloging between 50 and 100,000 clients of the Odyssey Foundation. According to Dallas Police Lieutenant Harold Hancock, the client list included prominent public and political figures. If you remember, this aligned with what Corll had told his accomplices, that he was part of a Dallas-based crime ring involved in you know what. And as it seems to always happen with these kinds of cases, the index cards were then shipped off to the State Department, which basically labeled them as irrelevant to the case and destroyed them. As for John David Norman, instead of facing justice for trafficking, he was merely charged with marijuana possession and conspiracy to commit sodomy. He was released on bail, paid by an anonymous California benefactor. Afterwards, he fled to Homewood, Illinois under the alias Stephen Gerwell, moving in with Charles Relling, one of his former clients from another one of his ventures called Epic International, essentially a global version of the Odyssey Foundation project. During his time in Illinois, Norman continued abusing minors, which led to his arrest and another seizure of disturbing materials and client lists. He was placed in Cook County Jail, but even there, his operation continued. Norman rebranded the Odyssey Foundation as the Delta Project, now promoting itself as a program to provide education, travel, and self-development opportunities for cadets. These youngsters were placed in so-called Delta dorms, supervised by adult dons, in reality, Norman's clients. Using the jail's printing cell, Norman sent out newsletters to his extensive client base. His right-hand man was Philip Paskey, a tall cross-dresser and convicted criminal serving time for accessory to murder. Together, they expanded the Delta Project from inside prison. Norman, by the way, was eventually sentenced to 4 years in prison, but once again, fortune seemed to favor him. Not long after his conviction, the boy he had assaulted in Illinois, the key witness against him, was gruesomely murdered on his way home. Then in May of 1977, a judge inexplicably ordered Norman's early release. He moved back to Chicago with Paskey, redecorating their basement apartment as a photography studio where they continued producing content for the Delta Project. Less than a year later, in June of 1978, Norman was arrested again after a boy named Michael Salcido reported him to the police. A raid of Norman's apartment turned up yet another cache of index cards cataloging his sprawling client network. But before Salcido could testify in court, he was found murdered in his car with his throat slit. Now, interestingly, investigators attributed Salcido's death to local drug dealers, just as they had previously dismissed the earlier witness's death as unrelated. But it does seem rather suspicious and kind of convenient for John David Norman that 2 of his victims were murdered just around the time of their court appearances. And yet, chillingly, the story has an even darker angle. In 1978, the world was horrified by the arrest of one of the most prolific serial killers of the era, John Wayne Gacy. Nicknamed the Killer Clown because he dressed as a clown for children's parties, Gacy was also a well-regarded member of Chicago society, a successful businessman and a local political connoisseur. Countless books and movies have been made about Gacy's life and his victims, many of whom were found buried in his crawl space beneath his house. And yet, if you dig a little bit deeper, you would see that the John Wayne Gacy story outreaches the traditional true crime circles. Not many people know this because not many people investigate this, but just like Dean Corll, John Wayne Gacy seemed to have a deeper connection to this network and seemed to not be, at least entirely, a lone wolf serial killer. When Gacy was arrested at a gas station near his home and taken to the police station, one of the first things he reportedly said was, "Who else do we have in the police station? There were others involved." During early interrogations, Gacy claimed that 2 employees of his company, BDM Contractors, David Cram and Michael Rossi, were involved in the crimes. I mean, the pair even admitted to helping Gacy dig graves in his crawl space. When police questioned them, Cram and Rossi stated that Gacy had told them he was part of a crime syndicate responsible for the killings of more than 30 youths. Weird, it's almost as if I heard this like 10 minutes ago from another guy. Gacy allegedly claimed that the syndicate used these murders to set people up. Later during his appearances, he expanded his story. Now 4 people were involved. Besides Cram and Rossi, he pointed that Philip Paskey and John David Norman were accomplices in the murders. There is in fact physical evidence linking Paskey to Gacy. Not only did Paskey knew Cram and Rossi, he also worked for Gacy's company. Gacy reportedly described him as a dangerous child who procured boys for sex and films. Gacy also claimed that both Norman and Paskey were heavily involved in producing these types of films. Furthermore, Gacy claimed that there were 12 keys handed out to his apartment. 4 of those keys were in the possession of Paskey, Norman, Cram, and Rossi. Now, having the Delta Project in mind, these cadets, young boys being sent to Delta dorms run by Dons, John Wayne Gacy's home sounds a lot like a dorm. In fact, in the great book, Eye of the Chicken Hawk by Simon Dowie, a list of 28 identified Gacy victims showed that the majority of their disappearances occurred while John David Norman was in Chicago close to Gacy. In fact, 2 of Gacy's victims were last seen near Norman's home. And yet, despite all of this compelling evidence, or at least very strong correlations, John Wayne Gacy was ultimately sentenced to death as a lone serial killer. John David Norman was undeniably a mysterious and powerful figure. For decades, he evaded long-term capture, often managing to slip away after arrests. In addition to the Delta Project, he became involved in distributing a newsletter called Hermes, which effectively promoted the Delta Project and other associated networks. This publication connected Norman to yet another operation on North Fox Island, led by a wealthy scion named Francis Sheldon. That network in turn has links to Oakland County child killer case and the Franklin scandal, both complex webs I intend to explore in a future video. To end the story on John David Norman, he was arrested again in 1990s and was released from prison in 1999, but he was ultimately declared a violent predator and hospitalized indefinitely. Philip Paskey died in 1998 from AIDS-related complications. Neither of them, in my opinion, faced meaningful punishments for their actions. They seemed always one step above the law, operating with near total impunity. Now, I've read a lot of literature and comments and a few videos on this network, and it seems a lot of people think that John David Norman was the chief operator of this. And while I do think Norman and Paskey were important, I don't think they were at the top of the food chain. I think that whoever protected and orchestrated this network is among those 50 to 100,000 names that were destroyed by the State Department. How far the rabbit hole goes, I simply can't cover in one video, because A, I don't know, and B, I don't have the means to investigate so deeply. It's, without a doubt, an underworld syndicate that combines business, politics, and organized crime. I mean, just as an example, a deposit slip from November of 1962 shows that one John D. Norman, perhaps John David Norman, rented an apartment in Dallas to a well-known mafia-connected figure named Jack Ruby. Yes, that Jack Ruby. People in my life that know I make these kinds of videos often ask me, why do I cover subjects like this? And my answer often is, I don't know, it's interesting. And while that is true, I do find subjects like this interesting. The real reason why I make and cover such gruesome topics is twofolded. First of all, I think issues like this are extremely important. However, networks like this are often hijacked by either the extreme left or the extreme right or everything in between, and you're often dubbed a lunatic for even talking about these issues. I think us as a society, regardless of which political spectrum you come from, should talk and critically assess these cases. That's why I'm not talking out of my head, and everything you see in this video, the reference files I used, can be checked out in my description below. Whatever I said in this video, don't take it for the truth. Explore the case yourself and form an opinion based on what you read. That's the first reason. I don't want these stories to be hijacked by conspiracy lunatics. If we want anything changed, we should have serious conversations about these issues. This shouldn't be a fringe topic. And the second reason I make these videos is precisely because they're dark, disturbing, and gruesome. Because no one else, or a very few others, will cover these subjects. I decided to cover them, and I will cover them in the future, because I think the innocent lives, the victims of these cases, deserve that. People should use their platforms, should use their voices, and not be scared to put a spotlight on these innocent young souls.